A newly adopted puppy begins changing rapidly, alarming her loving family with behaviors they'd never seen before. At first, they thought she was just adjusting to her new home, but when their beloved pet starts growing at an impossible rate and displaying strange instincts, they know something isn't right. The vet examines her and goes completely silent, staring at the test results in disbelief. This isn't an ordinary dog at all, but something the family never imagined they'd bring into their home. What is this creature they've been raising as their pet? And what happens when the truth about her identity puts the entire family in danger? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind howled through the cracks of the old farmhouse, making the wooden beams creak and groan. Lightning split the dark sky, followed by a thunderous boom that shook the windows. Inside the cozy living room, 10-year-old Hannah Whitmore pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to make herself as small as possible in the corner of the worn leather couch. "It's okay, sweetie," Clara Whitmore said, rubbing her daughter's back in gentle circles. "The storm will pass soon." Another crack of lightning illuminated the room, and Hannah buried her face in her mother's sleeve. Her little brother Noah, only 5 years old, sat on the floor playing with his toy trucks, seemingly unbothered by nature's fury outside. Ben Whitmore paced near the window, his weathered face creased with worry as he watched the storm rage across their farmland. The cornstalks bent almost double in the fierce wind, and he could hear the anxious sounds of the animals in the barn. "The horses are getting spooked," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "I should check on them." "They'll be fine, Ben," Clara said firmly, still holding Hannah close. "The barn's sturdy. It's held through worse storms than this." Hannah flinched as another boom of thunder rattled the house. "Make it stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, make it stop." Ben's heart ached, seeing his daughter so frightened. Hannah had always been a nervous child, but thunderstorms brought out her worst fears. He walked over and knelt beside the couch, his kind eyes meeting hers. "Hey there, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about? Count with me between the lightning and thunder. It helps us know how far away the storm is." A brilliant flash lit up the room, and Hannah squeezed her eyes shut. Ben started counting out loud. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. The thunder crashed before he reached 4. "See? It's moving away already. It was 5 seconds last time," he said encouragingly, though he knew the storm was still directly overhead. Noah looked up from his trucks. "Daddy, the cows are going to be scared too, right?" "They'll be just fine, buddy. They're safe and dry in the barn." Ben stood up and walked back to the window, watching sheets of rain slash across the yard. The old oak tree's branches whipped back and forth, and somewhere in the distance, he heard the metallic clang of something blowing over. Then, during a brief lull in the wind, he heard something else, a faint whimpering sound coming from outside. He pressed his ear against the window, straining to listen. "Ben?" Clara called from the couch. "What is it?" "I thought I heard." There it was again, a distinct crying sound, barely audible above the storm. "There's something out there." Clara's expression turned worried. "Don't you dare go out in this weather." But Ben was already pulling on his rubber boots and reaching for his heavy rain jacket. "Whatever it is, it sounds scared. I'll just take a quick look around the barn." "Daddy, no," Hannah cried, her eyes wide with fear. "Please don't go out there." "I'll be right back, Princess, promise." He zipped up his jacket and grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. 5 minutes, tops." Clara stood up, her face stern. "Ben Whitmore, this is crazy. You could get hurt out there." "I'll be careful," he assured her, then stepped out onto the covered porch. The wind immediately tried to tear the door from his grip, and rain pelted his face sideways. Ben pulled his collar up and switched on the flashlight, its beam barely cutting through the darkness and driving rain. He made his way carefully across the yard, mud squelching under his boots. The whimpering seemed to be coming from near the barn. As he got closer, he swept the flashlight beam back and forth until it caught a reflection, two tiny eyes gleaming back at him from under an overturned wheelbarrow. Ben crouched down, shielding his light so it wouldn't frighten whatever was hiding there. A small, soaked puppy cowered in the mud, its whole body trembling. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, with dark fur plastered to its skinny frame. "Hey there, little one," Ben said softly, extending his hand slowly. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The puppy shrank back at first, then cautiously sniffed his fingers. Another crash of thunder sent it scrambling forward into Ben's arms, pressing against his chest. "You poor thing," he murmured, cradling the shivering creature inside his jacket. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry." When Ben burst back through the front door, water streaming from his clothes, Clara was ready with a lecture. But the words died on her lips when she saw what he was carrying. "Oh my," she breathed as Ben gently pulled the puppy from inside his jacket. "Where did you find it?" Hannah lifted her head at the commotion, and her eyes went wide at the sight of the tiny dog. For the first time that evening, she forgot about the storm, uncurling from her protective ball on the couch. "Here," Ben said, grabbing a clean towel from the laundry basket. "Hannah, would you like to help dry this little puppy off?" Hannah nodded, reaching for the towel with trembling hands. Ben carefully placed the puppy in her lap, and she began to pat it dry with gentle, hesitant movements. The puppy stopped shaking and looked up at her with soulful brown eyes. "It's a girl," Hannah whispered, the softest smile appearing on her face as the puppy nuzzled her hand. "Can we call her Daisy?" Clara opened her mouth to protest. They couldn't just keep a stray dog. There were so many things to consider. But the words caught in her throat. Her daughter, who had been paralyzed with fear just minutes ago, was now completely focused on the puppy, her usual anxiety forgotten. Noah scrambled up onto the couch beside his sister. "Hi, Daisy," he said excitedly. The puppy responded with a tiny tail wag and a lick to his hand. "She needs to sleep somewhere warm tonight," Ben said, giving Claire a meaningful look. "Just for tonight, at least." Another rumble of thunder rolled overhead, but this time Hannah barely noticed. She was too busy wrapping Daisy in the towel like a baby, holding her close. "You can sleep in my room," she told the puppy. "I'll keep you safe." Later that night, as the storm began to fade, Clara checked on Hannah before going to bed. She found her daughter fast asleep, one hand resting on Daisy, who was curled up against her side. The puppy lifted her head briefly, gave a contented sigh, then snuggled closer to Hannah. "You're safe now," Hannah murmured in her sleep. "And so am I." Daisy responded with a gentle lick to her face before settling back down, both girl and puppy finding comfort in each other as the last distant rumbles of thunder faded away. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the farmland in soft golden hues. The grass, still wet from last night's storm, sparkled with morning dew. Everything was quiet and peaceful, until a chorus of startled chicken squawks broke the silence. Daisy, her dark fur now dry and fluffy, darted back and forth behind the chickens with surprising skill. Her small body moved with purpose, keeping the flock together as they scattered and regrouped in confused patterns. The tiny pup seemed to know exactly where to position herself, guiding the chickens with gentle persistence. Hannah stood by the chicken coop's fence, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle her giggles. It was a sound that hadn't been heard around the farm for months, and it drew Clara to the kitchen window. She watched in amazement as her usually withdrawn daughter actually laughed out loud when Daisy managed to guide all the chickens into a perfect circle. "Did you see that, Mom?" Hannah called out, her eyes bright with excitement. "She's helping them exercise." Clara couldn't help but smile. "I see it, honey. Why don't you come in for breakfast? Bring Daisy, too." Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Ben sat at the worn wooden table, bills spread out before him. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten as he frowned at the numbers that refused to add up favorably. Clara set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him, touching his shoulder gently. "The feed costs went up again," he said quietly, making sure Hannah couldn't hear as she helped Noah wash his hands at the sink. "And the repair bill for the tractor was higher than expected." Clara's face tightened with worry. "How bad is it?" "We're barely breaking even this month." Ben pushed the papers aside as Hannah and Daisy came to the table. The puppy sat perfectly beside Hannah's chair, as if she'd been trained to do so all her life. "I hate to say it, but if things don't improve—" "Don't," Clara whispered, shaking her head slightly. She knew what he was thinking. They might have to sell the farm. The thought made her stomach clench. A sharp knock at the screen door interrupted their conversation. Rick Caldwell stood on their porch, his tall frame casting a shadow through the mesh. He was a neighbor whose farm lay adjacent to theirs, though neighbor was perhaps too friendly a term for the man who seemed to take pleasure in their struggles. "Morning, Whitmores," Rick called out, his voice carrying a false cheerfulness. His eyes immediately fixed on Daisy, who had moved to stand slightly in front of Hannah. "So the rumors are true. You've got yourself a new dog." Ben stood up, walking to the door, but not opening it. "What can we do for you, Rick?" "Just being neighborly," Rick said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Heard some commotion with the chickens earlier. Thought maybe you were having trouble with predators." "No trouble here," Ben replied firmly. "Daisy was just helping with the morning rounds." Rick's eyebrows rose. "Helping? That little thing?" He leaned closer to the screen, studying Daisy with newfound interest. "Looks like she might have some good breeding in her. Fancy herding dogs like that are wasted on struggling farms, don't you think? Shame to see good stock go to waste." Hannah's hand found Daisy's fur, gripping it gently. The puppy pressed against her leg, never taking her eyes off Rick. "We're doing just fine, Rick," Clara said, coming to stand beside Ben. "Thank you for your concern." After Rick left, the family went about their daily routine, but now with an enthusiastic addition. Daisy followed Hannah everywhere, her presence seeming to give the girl a new confidence. When Hannah helped feed the horses, Daisy trotted alongside, carrying a small bucket in her mouth. During Ben's inspection of the fence line, both Hannah and Daisy rode in the truck, the puppy's head held high as she watched the passing fields. Even during Hannah's homeschool lessons at the kitchen table, Daisy lay quietly by her feet, occasionally nudging her hand when she sensed Hannah's frustration with a difficult math problem. The simple contact seemed to calm Hannah, helping her focus better than she had in months. Throughout the day, Daisy's natural instincts became more apparent. When Noah wandered too close to the pond while playing, Daisy gently herded him back toward the house, staying between him and the water. She seemed to have an uncanny sense of where everyone should be, especially Hannah. If Hannah strayed too far from sight while collecting eggs, Daisy would bark once, drawing Clara's attention to her daughter's location. As evening approached, the family gathered on the front porch to enjoy the cooler air. Ben and Clara sat in the old rocking chairs, while Hannah and Noah played a board game on the porch floor, Daisy watching attentively from her spot beside Hannah. The peaceful scene was suddenly interrupted when Daisy's head snapped up, her ears forward and alert. A low growl rumbled in her throat as she stood, Facing the tree line where the last rays of sunlight cast long shadows across their property. Something moved in the darkness between the trees, a shadow that was too large to be a rabbit, too swift to be a deer. Ben stood slowly, his eyes straining to make out the shape. "Everyone inside," he said quietly but firmly. But Daisy didn't retreat. Instead, she moved forward to the top of the porch steps, her small body rigid and protective. Despite her puppy size, there was nothing uncertain about her stance. She planted herself firmly between her family and whatever lurked in the shadows, her bark sharp and authoritative. Ben watched the tiny dog standing guard, and in that moment, he realized something important. Daisy wasn't just some stray puppy they had rescued from a storm. She was a guardian, born with instincts to protect and serve. In just one day, she had shown more natural ability than most trained dogs he'd known. Days later, the morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on the pile of papers Clara was sorting through. Among the usual bills and advertisements, a bright yellow flyer caught her attention. She pulled it out and placed it on the kitchen table, smoothing its creased edges. "Look at this, Hannah," Clara said gently, trying to keep her voice casual. "The community center is hosting a public speaking contest next month. The theme is What Matters Most to Me." Hannah, who had been contentedly feeding Daisy bits of breakfast bacon under the table, froze. Her shoulders tensed visibly as her eyes darted to the yellow paper, then quickly away. The mere thought of standing in front of a crowd made her stomach twist into knots. Clara watched her daughter's reaction carefully, noting how Hannah's hand automatically reached down to touch Daisy's fur, a gesture that had become her unconscious source of comfort over the past few days. The puppy responded immediately, pressing closer against Hannah's leg. "The first prize is $200, Clara continued, keeping her tone light. "And there's a special category for elementary school students." Hannah's face had gone pale, and she began pushing her scrambled eggs around her plate without eating. I don't want to," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Noah, who had been unusually quiet while shoveling cereal into his mouth, suddenly perked up. "Maybe Daisy can help," he exclaimed, milk dribbling down his chin. "She makes everything better." Hannah looked at her little brother, then down at Daisy, who gazed back with those intelligent dark eyes. The puppy's tail thumped against the floor, and despite her anxiety, Hannah felt a tiny smile tugging at her lips. Clara didn't push the subject, but she left the flyer on the kitchen table. Throughout the morning, she noticed Hannah stealing glances at it when she thought no one was watching. Later that afternoon, Hannah wandered out to the back field with Daisy, trotting faithfully by her side. She carried her mother's old gardening stool, setting it up under the shade of the big oak tree. Daisy sat in front of her, head tilted slightly, ears perked forward. "I don't know what to do, Daisy," Hannah said softly, her fingers playing with a blade of grass. To her surprise, the words came easier when it was just the two of them. "Speaking in front of people, it's scary. My heart feels like it's going to explode, and my hands get all sweaty, and sometimes I forget how to breathe." Daisy scooted closer, resting her chin on Hannah's knee. Her warm brown eyes never left Hannah's face, and her tail swayed gently back and forth. Encouraged by the puppy's attentiveness, Hannah continued, "Last year in Mrs. Peterson's class, I had to give a book report. I got so nervous I couldn't say anything. Just stood there, staring at my shoes while everyone watched. Tommy Jenkins laughed, and I started crying." Daisy let out a soft whine and licked Hannah's hand. The simple gesture made Hannah feel braver somehow. From the porch, Clara watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with hope. For months she'd worried about Hannah's increasing withdrawal, her reluctance to speak up or participate in activities. But now, watching her daughter talk freely to Daisy, Clara saw a glimpse of the confident child she knew Hannah could become. Meanwhile, in the eastern pasture, Ben was discovering something remarkable about their new four-legged family member. He'd been checking the fence line when he noticed 3 sheep had wandered through a gap in the wire. Before he could react, Daisy was already on the move. The tiny puppy circled the sheep with surprising speed and precision, her movements fluid and purposeful. Ben watched in amazement as she guided the animals back toward the gap, never rushing or frightening them. Her technique was instinctive, the kind of natural ability that couldn't be taught. "Well, I'll be," Ben muttered, scratching his head as Daisy successfully herded the sheep back into the pasture. She returned to his side, tail wagging, looking mighty pleased with herself. A thought began to take shape in Ben's mind. Good herding dogs were worth their weight in gold, and Daisy was showing promise beyond her young age. With proper training, she could help manage the livestock, reducing the need for hired help. Maybe, just maybe, this little stray could be part of the solution to their financial troubles. As evening approached and the family gathered for dinner, Hannah's eyes kept drifting to the yellow flyer still sitting on the kitchen table. The paper seemed less threatening now, after spending the afternoon talking to Daisy. The puppy lay at her feet, a warm, reassuring presence. Hannah reached down and picked up the flyer, really reading it for the first time. The knot in her stomach was still there, but it felt smaller somehow. Daisy's tail thumped against the floor, the rhythm steady and encouraging. "What matters most to me," Hannah whispered, testing the words. Daisy's ears perked up, and she lifted her head, giving Hannah that familiar head tilt that seemed to say, "Go on, I'm listening." Hannah looked at the flyer again, then at Daisy, who wagged her tail with such enthusiasm that her whole body wiggled. The sight made Hannah giggle softly. Maybe, just maybe, with Daisy by her side, she could find the courage to try. Rick Caldwell stood at his property line, binoculars pressed against his eyes as he watched the scene unfolding on the Whitmore farm. His jaw clenched tighter with each passing moment. That little puppy, Daisy, was moving like a seasoned pro, expertly guiding Ben's sheep across the pasture with graceful precision. "Duke, get over here!" Rick barked at his own sheepdog who was lounging in the shade of an old oak tree. The aging dog lifted his head lazily, gave a half-hearted wag of his tail, then flopped back down. Rick's face burned with embarrassment, even though no one was around to witness his dog's disobedience. "Useless mutt," he muttered, turning his attention back to the Whitmore's property. Through his binoculars, he could see Ben standing with his hands on his hips, nodding approvingly as Daisy worked. The puppy moved with an uncanny intelligence, responding to the slightest shifts in the sheep's movements before they could even stray from the group. Rick lowered the binoculars, his mouth set in a hard line. Something wasn't right. He'd spent good money on Duke from a reputable breeder, trained him properly, and still, the dog had never shown half the natural ability that this mysterious stray possessed. Where had the Whitmores found such a remarkable animal? And why did they, of all people, deserve her? The next morning, Rick made his way to Johnson's feed store, timing his visit to coincide with the morning rush of local farmers. He grabbed a bag of chicken feed he didn't really need and lingered near the counter where old Tom Johnson was holding court with his usual crowd of regulars. "Say, Tom," Rick called out, keeping his voice casual, "you hear anything about that new dog the Whitmores picked up?" He dropped his feed bag on the counter, pretending to search for his wallet. Tom scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. "That little pup they found during the storm? Heard she's quite something with the livestock." "Found during the storm, you say?" Rick pressed, his interest piqued. "Just showed up out of nowhere?" "That's the story," Bill Peterson chimed in from his perch on a stack of feed bags. "Ben found her huddled under some farm equipment. Lucky break for them, if you ask me. That dog's got natural talent." Rick nodded slowly, processing this information. Natural talent, huh? What kind of dog is she? The group of farmers exchanged glances and shrugs. Some kind of herding breed, I reckon, Tom offered, though I've never seen one quite like her around these parts. Rick paid for his chicken feed and headed straight home, his mind churning. He spent the next several hours hunched over his computer, scrolling through pages about herding breeds. German shepherds, border collies, Australian cattle dogs, none of them quite matched what he'd observed in Daisy. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore farm, Ben was watching Daisy work with growing excitement. The puppy had just successfully guided a group of stubborn ewes into the barn, making the task look effortless. Clara stood beside him, equally impressed. "You know," Ben said thoughtfully, "with proper training, Daisy could be more than just a farm dog. Professional herding dogs can earn good money at trials and competitions. Some folks even pay top dollar for their services." Hannah, who had been sitting on a nearby hay bale doing her homework, looked up sharply. Her pencil stopped moving mid-sentence, and her face went pale. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ben, noticing his daughter's distress, quickly added, "We'd need to get her properly trained. Maybe take her to some classes." "You want to send her away?" Hannah's voice cracked, and Daisy immediately abandoned her post by the sheep to press against the girl's legs. Clara stepped forward, kneeling beside Hannah. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Nobody's sending Daisy anywhere. We're just talking about possibilities, that's all." "But," Hannah's lower lip quivered as she wrapped her arms around Daisy's neck, "what if the trainers want to keep her? What if she likes it better there?" "Oh, honey," Clara soothed, "Daisy's part of our family now. If we do any training, it would be together, all of us. We wouldn't do anything you're not comfortable with." Ben nodded in agreement, mentally kicking himself for not being more sensitive to Hannah's fears. "Your mom's right. Daisy's home is here with us, especially with you. That won't change." Back at his farm, Rick had finally stumbled upon something interesting. His eyes narrowed as he read an article about a rare Portuguese breed called Cão de Castro Laboreiro. The photo showed dogs with distinctive markings similar to Daisy's, and the description of their herding abilities matched what he'd observed. As he dug deeper, a news article caught his attention. "Valuable Portuguese herding dogs stolen from breeder." Rick leaned closer to his screen, his heart racing as he read about several puppies that had been taken from a prestigious breeding facility months ago. The dogs were worth thousands of dollars each. He clicked through more photos, comparing them to mental images of Daisy. The coloring, the size, the unique way she moved. It all fit. Rick's hands clenched into fists as he thought about the Whitmores having such a valuable animal practically fall into their laps. Standing up from his desk, Rick moved to his window. From here, he could just make out the Whitmore farm in the distance. He watched as Ben's truck kicked up dust on the long driveway, probably heading into town for supplies. His eyes narrowed as he considered the implications of his discovery. A dark idea began taking shape in his mind as he watched the farm. If Daisy really was one of those stolen Portuguese dogs, then the Whitmores had no right to her. They were struggling to keep their farm afloat. How could they possibly deserve such a valuable animal? Rick turned back to his computer, opening a new tab to do more research. He needed to be certain before he made his next move. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he considered how to proceed, his jealousy and resentment fueling his determination to prove his suspicions right. The next day, the early morning light crept through Hannah's window, painting her room in soft golden hues. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she was surprised to find herself awake before her alarm clock. Usually, getting up early filled her with dread, but today felt different. She turned her head to find Daisy already up, sitting alertly by the window, her silhouette framed against the dawn sky. The puppy's ears were perked forward, her attention focused on the farm coming to life outside. Hannah could hear the distant sounds of roosters crowing and cattle lowing in their pastures. She watched as Daisy's head tilted slightly, tracking the movement of birds swooping past the window. Slipping out of bed, Hannah padded across the wooden floor in her sock feet. The familiar morning anxiety that usually churned in her stomach was notably absent. Instead, she felt a strange sense of peace as she settled beside Daisy, wrapping her arms around the puppy's warm body. "You're already watching over everything, aren't you?" Hannah whispered, running her fingers through Daisy's soft fur. The puppy turned to look at her, dark eyes full of intelligence and affection. Hannah pressed her face into Daisy's neck, breathing in the comforting scent. "I think you're magic," she murmured. Daisy responded with a gentle lick to Hannah's cheek, making the girl giggle softly. Together, they watched the sun climb higher, casting long shadows across the farmyard. For the first time in years, Hannah didn't feel afraid of what the day might bring. Later that morning, Ben stood in the south pasture, a whistle in his hand and determination in his eyes. He'd been reading up on proper herding dog training techniques, watching videos online whenever he had a spare moment. Now it was time to put theory into practice. "All right, girl," he said to Daisy, who sat attentively at his feet. "Let's see what you can do." He raised the whistle to his lips and gave a short, sharp blast, the signal they'd agreed would mean come. To his amazement, Daisy responded instantly, circling back to his side with perfect precision. Ben blinked in surprise. He'd expected to spend weeks just teaching her the basic commands. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered, impressed. He tried another whistle pattern, this one for go right. Again, Daisy moved exactly as directed, no hesitation, no confusion. For the next hour, Ben put Daisy through her paces, testing different commands and situations. Each time she responded as if she'd been training for years rather than minutes. She anticipated the sheep's movements, responded to the subtlest changes in his whistle signals, and maintained perfect control of the herd. Clara stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, and watched in amazement as Daisy expertly guided a group of sheep through a complex pattern. "I've never seen anything like it," she called out to Ben. Ben wiped sweat from his forehead, grinning broadly. "She's something special, that's for sure." His mind was already racing with possibilities. With a dog like this, they could take on more livestock, maybe even offer herding services to neighboring farms. The extra income could make all the difference. For the first time in months, he felt real hope about their financial situation. Maybe they wouldn't have to sell the farm after all. Maybe Daisy was the miracle they'd been praying for. Inside the house, Hannah sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a piece of paper clutched in her hands. She'd been staring at the words of her speech for what felt like hours, her heart racing every time she thought about standing in front of her classmates. Daisy trotted in from her morning training session, immediately settling down in front of Hannah. Her tail wagged encouragingly, and she tilted her head as if to say, "Go on, I'm listening." Taking a deep breath, Hannah began to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "The importance of farm animals in our lives." She paused, glancing nervously at Daisy. The puppy maintained eye contact, tail still wagging steadily. Encouraged by this attentive audience, Hannah continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. "Many people don't realize how much we depend on farms and the animals that live on them." Clara, who had been about to enter the room, stopped in the doorway. She held her breath, not wanting to interrupt this precious moment. She watched as her daughter, who normally struggled to speak up even in family discussions, read her speech to Daisy. When Hannah finished reading, Clara couldn't help but step forward. "That was wonderful, sweetheart," she said softly. Hannah jumped slightly, but didn't retreat into herself as she usually would. Instead, she offered a small smile. "Daisy helps," she explained. "She listens without judging." Clara knelt beside her daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Hannah. You've come so far in just these few weeks." The evening sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks as Hannah sat on the porch steps, her speech paper still in her hands. Daisy lay beside her, head resting on Hannah's lap, a constant source of comfort and strength. Hannah looked down at the words she'd written, then at Daisy, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It wasn't the usual knot of anxiety that had been her constant companion for so long. Instead, it felt light, almost buoyant. "Maybe I really can do this," she said softly, scratching behind Daisy's ears. The puppy's tail thumped against the wooden porch steps in response, and Hannah felt her smile grow wider. Days later, dark clouds loomed over the horizon, their ominous presence casting deep shadows across the Whitmore farm. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity, and the wind had picked up considerably in the last hour. Ben stood on the porch watching the approaching storm with concern etched on his weathered face. "This one's going to be bad," he called out to Clara, who was helping Noah gather his scattered toys from the yard. "We need to get everything secured." Inside the house, Hannah watched through the window as her father hurried toward the barn. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the windowsill, but she forced herself to take deep breaths, just like she'd been practicing. Behind her, Daisy paced restlessly near the door, her nails clicking against the wooden floor. "What's wrong, girl?" Hannah asked, turning away from the window. The dog's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by an anxious energy. She would walk to the door, whine softly, then return to Hannah's side, only to repeat the process again. Outside, Ben and Clara worked quickly to prepare for the incoming storm. They guided the sheep into the barn, checked that the chicken coop was secure, and made sure all the farm equipment was properly stored. The wind grew stronger with each passing minute, whipping Clara's hair around her face as she helped Ben close up the barn doors. Hannah," Clara called as she rushed back to the house. "Help me get the windows closed, sweetheart." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Hannah flinched. But with Daisy pressed against her leg, she managed to help her mother close and lock all the windows. The dog's presence gave her strength, even as the sky grew darker and the wind howled more fiercely. The storm hit with devastating force. Rain pounded against the roof like thousands of tiny hammers, and the wind screamed around the corners of the house. When the power flickered once, twice, and then died completely, Hannah let out a small whimper. "It's okay," Clara soothed, lighting candles around the living room. "We're all safe inside." Ben's cell phone rang, barely audible over the storm's fury. His face grew serious as he listened to the caller, and Hannah watched as all the color drained from his expression. "What is it?" Clara asked, moving closer. "That was Tom Mitchell," Ben said, his voice tight with worry. "His little girl, Emily, she's missing. She was playing in their backyard when the storm hit, and now they can't find her anywhere. They're gathering search parties, but in this weather." He glanced out the window at the sheets of rain. Hannah's heart clenched. Emily Mitchell was only 3 years old. The thought of the tiny girl out there in the storm made Hannah's own fear seem smaller somehow. Daisy's behavior suddenly changed. Her ears perked forward and she began barking urgently at the door. Before anyone could stop her, she had nosed the handle open and bolted out into the storm. "Daisy!" Hannah cried. Without thinking, without allowing her fear time to paralyze her, she ran after the dog. She heard her parents calling her name, but the sound was lost in the howling wind. Rain pelted Hannah's face as she followed Daisy's form through the darkness. The dog seemed to know exactly where she was going, leading them away from the farm and into the woods that separated their property from the Mitchells. Hannah's shoes squelched in the mud, and branches whipped at her face, but she kept running. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in brief, stark bursts. Hannah's heart hammered in her chest, but she focused on Daisy's white form ahead of her. The dog would stop occasionally, waiting for Hannah to catch up, before plunging forward again. They went deeper into the woods than Hannah had ever ventured before. The ground began to slope downward, and Hannah had to grab onto trees to keep from sliding in the mud. Suddenly, Daisy stopped, barking frantically at something ahead. Another flash of lightning revealed what had caught Daisy's attention. There, in a deep drainage ditch, was little Emily Mitchell. The toddler was clinging to a protruding root, water swirling around her legs and rising quickly with the rain. "Emily," Hannah called out. "Hold on." The little girl looked up, her face streaked with tears and rain. "Help!" she cried, her voice tiny against the storm. Daisy didn't hesitate. The dog leaped down into the ditch, carefully making her way to Emily. She pressed her body against the bank, creating a stable platform for the toddler to stand on, raising her above the rising water. Hannah pulled out her phone with shaking hands, relieved to see it still worked. She dialed her father's number, practically shouting to be heard over the storm. "Dad, we found her. We're in the woods, in the big ditch near the old oak tree. Hurry!" Daisy's barking grew louder, more insistent. The sound carried through the woods, a beacon for the searchers. Hannah could hear distant voices calling, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. "Over here!" she screamed, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it before. "We're over here!" The search party arrived minutes later, led by Ben and Tom Mitchell. They quickly but carefully retrieved Emily from the ditch, with Daisy staying right beside her until she was safely in her father's arms. The toddler was cold and frightened, but otherwise unharmed. "My baby," Tom Mitchell sobbed, clutching his daughter close. "How did you find her?" "It was Daisy," Hannah explained, as her own parents wrapped her in a tight embrace. "She knew something was wrong. She led me right to Emily." The group made their way back through the woods, flashlight beams bouncing off the rain-slicked trees. The storm was beginning to ease, its fury spent. Daisy trotted alongside them, mud-covered but proud, occasionally checking on Emily as if making sure she was still safe. When they reached the Mitchell house, where the rest of the search party had gathered, a cheer went up at the sight of Emily safe in her father's arms. People crowded around, patting Daisy's head and calling her a hero. The dog accepted the attention gracefully, but stayed close to Hannah's side. Ben and Clara held Hannah between them, their eyes shining with pride and amazement. Their daughter, who had once been too afraid to even speak in class, had just run into a raging storm to save a life. Clara brushed Hannah's wet hair from her face, tears mixing with raindrops. "You were so brave," she whispered. Days later, the town hall buzzed with excitement as people gathered for what they called Daisy's Day. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and someone had even baked dog-shaped cookies. The room was packed with familiar faces from around the community, all eager to celebrate the heroic dog who had saved little Emily Mitchell. Hannah stood near the entrance, her fingers twisted in Daisy's fur. Her heart thumped rapidly in her chest as she watched more people file in. The mayor had asked her to say a few words, and despite practicing all week with Daisy, her mouth felt dry. "You okay, sweetheart?" Clara asked, placing a gentle hand on Hannah's shoulder. Hannah nodded, though her grip on Daisy's fur tightened slightly. The dog responded by pressing closer against her leg, offering silent support. Looking down into those warm brown eyes, Hannah felt her anxiety ease a little. Ben stood nearby, chatting with Tom Mitchell, who couldn't stop praising Daisy and Hannah for saving his daughter. Emily herself toddled over to Daisy, giggling as the dog gently licked her hand. The sight of the little girl, safe and happy, helped Hannah remember why she had agreed to speak today. Mayor Wilson stepped up to the small podium at the front of the room. "If I could have everyone's attention," she called out, her voice warm and welcoming. "We're here today to honor not just an extraordinary dog, but an extraordinary young lady as well." The crowd quieted, and Hannah felt her chest tighten. Daisy looked up at her, tail wagging encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Hannah walked toward the front of the room, the dog matching her pace perfectly. "I know many of you have heard about what happened during last week's storm," Mayor Wilson continued. "But I think we should hear it from Hannah herself. Hannah." The room fell silent as Hannah approached the podium. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the small piece of paper where she'd written her speech. Daisy sat beside her, alert and protective, just as she had during all their practice sessions at home. Hannah's voice cracked slightly, but she felt Daisy's warm presence and continued. "I used to be scared of everything. Storms, speaking up in class, meeting new people." She paused, gathering courage. "But then Daisy came to us during another storm, and everything changed." As Hannah spoke, her voice grew stronger. She told the story of the rescue, not as the terrifying experience it had been, but as a moment when she discovered her own bravery. "Daisy showed me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right, even when you are scared." In the crowd, Clara wiped tears from her eyes while Ben beamed with pride. The townspeople listened intently, many nodding in understanding. Near the back of the room, a distinguished-looking man in a tweed jacket watched with particular interest, his eyes focused on Daisy's every movement. After Hannah finished speaking, people came forward to meet Daisy up close. The dog greeted everyone politely, but always returned to Hannah's side, as if making sure she was comfortable with all the attention. Dr. Julian Navarro, the visiting animal behaviorist, observed from a slight distance. His trained eye noted how Daisy consistently positioned herself between Hannah and the crowd, how she seemed to read the girl's anxiety levels and adjust her behavior accordingly. When someone approached too quickly, Daisy would shift slightly, creating a subtle barrier. The dog's herding instincts were evident even here as she gently guided people into a natural flow around Hannah, preventing her from feeling overwhelmed. Dr. Navarro pulled out a small notebook, jotting down his observations. At one point, little Emily broke away from her parents and ran straight for Daisy. Without any command, the dog smoothly intercepted the toddler, redirecting her momentum into a gentler approach. It was the kind of instinctive behavior that spoke of careful breeding and inherited traits. Near the refreshment table, Rick Caldwell stood alone, his face dark with barely concealed anger. He watched as people praised the Whitmores and fawned over Daisy. His own dog, a purebred border collie, had never shown half the intelligence or skill that this supposed stray possessed. Rick's eyes narrowed as he observed Dr. Navarro taking notes. So he wasn't the only one who thought there was something special about this dog. His online research about the Portuguese breeding program kept nagging at him. The timing of Daisy's appearance, her unusual abilities, it all fit too perfectly to be coincidence. The celebration continued, with people sharing stories about their own experiences with Daisy. The Mitchell family had brought pictures of Emily playing with the dog since the rescue. The feed store owner talked about how Daisy always carried his newspaper to Ben when they visited. Even the school principal mentioned how the dog waited patiently outside Hannah's classroom every day. Throughout it all, Dr. Navarro continued his careful observation. He noted Daisy's distinctive facial features, the unique way she moved, and her extraordinary level of situational awareness. Something about her reminded him of a case he'd worked on years ago, involving rare working dogs from European breeding programs. As the afternoon wore on, people began to drift away. Hannah sat in a corner with Emily, showing the toddler how to properly pet Daisy, while Clara helped clean up the refreshment table. Ben was thanking the mayor for organizing the celebration when Dr. Navarro approached him. The animal behaviorist's expression was serious as he gestured Ben aside. They moved to a quiet corner of the room, away from the remaining guests. Daisy's ears perked up, and she watched them intently from her position near Hannah. "Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Navarro said in a low voice, his professional demeanor evident in every word. "This is no ordinary dog," he said gravely. "I need to speak with you privately." Ben followed Dr. Navarro into his office at the local veterinary clinic, Clara close behind. The small room was lined with diplomas and certificates, but what caught their attention was the laptop screen Dr. Navarro turned to show them. "Take a look at this article," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "It's from 6 months ago." The headline read, "Rare Portuguese Dog Stolen from Elite Breeding Program." Below it was a photo that made both Ben and Clara lean in closer. The puppies in the image looked exactly like Daisy, the same distinctive facial markings, the same intelligent eyes, even the same unique way of holding their heads. "These are Cão de Castro Laboreiro dogs," Dr. Navarro explained, pronouncing the unfamiliar words carefully. "They're extremely rare, even in Portugal where they originate. There are only a handful of specialized breeders in the world." Clara sank into a nearby chair, her hand covering her mouth. "But Daisy was just a stray we found during the storm." "I've worked with rare breeds for 20 years, Dr. Navarro continued, scrolling through more photos. "The characteristics are unmistakable. The way Daisy moves, her herding instincts, her extraordinary intelligence. These are hallmarks of the breed. But more than that, they're specifically traits of this breeding line." Ben shook his head, his farmer's hands gripping the back of Clara's chair. "That's impossible. We're in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. How would a Portuguese dog end up here?" Dr. Navarro pulled up another article. 6 months ago, thieves broke into one of Portugal's most prestigious breeding facilities. They took 5 puppies, all female, all around 8 weeks old. The dogs were being prepared for specialized training programs, search and rescue, police work, advanced herding. Their estimated value, ... He paused, letting them see the number on the screen. Clara gasped. "That's more than our farm is worth." "The timing matches, Doctor," Navarro said quietly. "Daisy would be exactly the right age now. And her abilities, they're not just exceptional, they're precisely what these dogs were bred for. The way she found that little girl in the storm, her natural herding abilities. These dogs have been carefully bred for centuries to have exactly these traits." Ben ran a hand through his hair, struggling to process the information. "But she was half-starved when we found her, terrified of the storm. My theory is that she escaped from whoever stole her," Dr. Navarro explained. "These dogs are incredibly intelligent. If she got away during transport..." He spread his hands. "She could have wandered for weeks before finding your farm." Meanwhile, across town, Rick Caldwell sat in his study, a satisfied smile on his face as he dialed an international number. His computer screen showed the same articles Dr. Navarro had been discussing, along with contact information for Eduardo Santos, the Portuguese breeder. "Yes, Mr. Santos?" Rick's voice was eager. "I believe I found one of your stolen puppies. She's being kept by a family here in Kansas." He listened for a moment, his smile growing wider. "Of course, I understand there's a reward. Yes, I can send you photos and video evidence." Unknown to the adults, Hannah had followed her parents to the vet's office. She stood just outside Doctor. Navarro's door, her heart pounding as she listened to their conversation. Each word felt like a physical blow. Stolen, valuable, Portuguese breeding program. The words swirled in her head, their meaning becoming horrifyingly clear. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to stay quiet even as tears began rolling down her cheeks. They were going to take Daisy away. They were going to send her back to Portugal, back to people who had never held her during a thunderstorm, never watched her herd chickens in the morning sun, never felt her gentle encouragement during speech practice. Hannah's legs felt weak. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. Through the door, she could hear Dr. Navarro explaining about breeding papers and DNA tests. Her mother's voice sounded shocked, her father's worried. "The breeder will want proof, of course," Dr. Navarro was saying. "But once he sees her, well, these dogs are like fingerprints to those who know them. Eduardo Santos will recognize her immediately." Hannah couldn't bear to hear more. She pushed herself up and ran from the building, tears blurring her vision. She ran all the way home, her lungs burning, but she didn't stop until she reached the farm. Daisy was waiting by the front porch, as she always did when any family member was away. She jumped up as Hannah approached, tail wagging, but her expression changed when she saw Hannah's tears. The dog pressed against her legs, whining softly in concern. Hannah dropped to her knees, throwing her arms around Daisy's neck. The dog stayed perfectly still, letting Hannah bury her face in her fur. They stayed that way for a long time, until Hannah's sobs quieted to hiccups. That evening, after a quiet dinner where nobody mentioned Dr. Navarro's revelation, Hannah sat on her bed with Daisy beside her. The dog's head rested in her lap as Hannah stroked her ears, memorizing every detail of her face. "They can't take you," Hannah whispered fiercely. "You're not just some valuable dog. You're my best friend. You're family." Daisy looked up at her with those intelligent eyes, the same eyes that had watched over her during storms, encouraged her during speech practice, and guided her through her fears. The dog shifted closer, pressing her warm body against Hannah's side. "No matter what happens," Hannah continued, her voice barely audible, "I won't let them take you." She wrapped her arms around Daisy's neck, holding her close. The dog responded by gently licking away a tear from Hannah's cheek, completely unaware of the storm brewing ahead. The next morning dawned cold and gray, matching the heavy mood in the Whitmore household. Ben sat at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold as he stared at his laptop screen. The formal email from Portugal had arrived just after sunrise, its contents confirming their worst fears. "Dear Mr. Whitmore," Ben read aloud to Clara, who stood behind him with her hands gripping his shoulders. "I am Eduardo Moreira, owner of the Castro Laboreiro Heritage Breeding Program in Portugal. Based on the photographs and description provided, I can confirm with certainty that the dog in your possession is one of our stolen puppies." Clara's grip tightened as Ben continued reading. The email was detailed and professional, laying out irrefutable evidence. Eduardo had included photographs of Daisy as a young puppy, documentation of her lineage, and most damning of all, her microchip number. "We checked her chip when Dr. Navarro first examined her," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "It matches exactly." Ben scrolled through the attached documents, each one feeling like another nail in their hopes. The breeding program was prestigious, the bloodlines carefully maintained for generations. Daisy wasn't just any dog. She represented years of careful selection and training. "He's demanding immediate return," Ben said, his voice rough. "Says he'll arrange transportation and cover all costs." He ran a hand over his face. "Clara, what are we going to do?" Before Clara could answer, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Hannah appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, Daisy faithfully at her side. One look at her parents' faces told her everything. "You got an email, didn't you?" Hannah's voice was small but steady. "From the people who want to take Daisy." Ben started to speak, but Hannah turned and fled back upstairs, Daisy following close behind. The sound of her bedroom door slamming echoed through the house. Later that morning, Ben and Clara sat in the cramped office of Sarah Mitchell, the town's only lawyer. The small room smelled of old books and coffee, and Sarah listened intently as they explained their situation. "Legally speaking," Sarah said, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined Eduardo's email, "there's no question. If this dog was stolen property and can be proven to belong to Mr. Moreira, which seems clear from this documentation, he has every right to reclaim her." Clara's shoulders slumped. "But she's not just property," she protested. "She's part of our family now. She saved that little girl in the storm. She's helping Hannah overcome her anxiety." Sarah's expression softened. "I understand. And while the law is clear, there might be room for negotiation. Mr. Moreira seems reasonable in his communication. Perhaps we could propose some sort of compromise?" "What kind of compromise?" Ben leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes. "Well," Sarah said thoughtfully, "given Daisy's breeding value and your farm's situation, perhaps there's a way to benefit both parties. But first, we need to—" A commotion outside interrupted their discussion. Through the office window, they could see Rick Caldwell holding court with a group of townspeople in the parking lot. "Those Whitmores," Rick's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "They probably knew all along what kind of dog she was. Bet they were planning to sell her themselves. Why else would a struggling farm keep such a valuable animal?" Ben's fists clenched, but Clara placed a restraining hand on his arm. Sarah shook her head in disgust. "Don't let him get to you," she advised. "Focus on what's important, finding a solution that works for your family and Mr. Moreira." Back at the farm, Hannah had barricaded herself in her room with Daisy. She'd pushed her dresser against the door and was sitting on her bed, arms wrapped around the dog's neck. Her lunch sat untouched on a tray outside her door, where Clara had left it. "They can't take you," Hannah whispered into Daisy's fur. "You're mine. You're ours." Daisy whined softly, sensing Hannah's distress, and pressed closer to her. Throughout the day, both Ben and Clara tried to coax Hannah out, but she remained silent, responding only with muffled sobs. They could hear her talking quietly to Daisy, making promises they knew she couldn't keep. The afternoon stretched into evening, and Rick's rumors spread through the small town like wildfire. Some neighbors who had celebrated Daisy's heroism just days before now whispered and speculated about the Whitmores' intentions. The weight of judgment and impending loss hung heavy over the farm. As darkness fell, Ben and Clara sat on their porch, exhausted and worried. The lights in Hannah's window remained on, a silent testament to their daughter's vigil with her beloved dog. "Maybe we should have checked for a microchip right away," Clara said softly. "Maybe we could have prevented all this heartbreak." Ben took her hand. "We did what any decent people would do. We helped a lost animal and gave her a home. We couldn't have known." The crunch of tires on gravel cut through the night air. Headlights swept across the farmhouse as a sleek rental car pulled into their driveway. Ben and Clara stood, their hearts pounding as a tall, well-dressed man emerged from the driver's side. His expensive suit seemed out of place against the backdrop of their modest farm. He carried himself with confidence and authority, but his expression was difficult to read in the porch light's dim glow. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore." His accent was distinctly Portuguese. "I am Eduardo Moreira. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Ben stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Clara. From somewhere upstairs, they heard Daisy bark once, a sound that seemed to make Eduardo's eyes light up with recognition. The moment hung suspended in the cool night air, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Two worlds were about to collide: the prestigious world of elite dog breeding and the simple life of a struggling farm family who had found something precious in a storm. Eduardo Moreira sat at the worn kitchen table, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the humble farmhouse interior. His fingers traced the rim of the coffee mug Clara had placed before him, steam rising in lazy spirals. Though his expression remained stern, there was a gentleness in his dark eyes that gave the Whitmores a glimmer of hope. "First, I must thank you for caring for her," Eduardo began, his Portuguese accent lending a musical quality to his words. "When she was taken, we feared the worst." Ben and Clara sat across from him, while Hannah huddled in the corner of the kitchen, Daisy pressed protectively against her legs. The dog's eyes never left Eduardo, her tail giving an occasional, uncertain wag. "It was a sophisticated operation," Eduardo continued, pulling out a tablet and showing them news articles. "They targeted specific breeds, rare ones with valuable bloodlines. The Cão de Castro Laboreiro is already endangered. We have perhaps a few hundred pure specimens left in the world." He swiped through photographs of similar-looking dogs. Daisy, or Luna as we called her, was one of our most promising puppies. Clara reached for Ben's hand under the table as Eduardo explained how the thieves had broken into their kennels one night, taking several puppies. "Most were recovered in Spain," he said. "But Luna, Daisy, disappeared completely. We tracked the chip to America, but then the trail went cold." He looked at the dog with obvious affection. "Until now, she found us in a storm," Ben explained quietly. "Scared, alone. We couldn't just leave her out there." Eduardo nodded. "Of course not. You did what any good people would do." He straightened in his chair. "But you must understand, she has a duty to her breed. These dogs are not just pets. They are living history, guardians of an ancient lineage that goes back centuries in Portugal." Hannah couldn't contain herself any longer. She stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling but determined. "Please don't take her away. She's more than just a breed. She's my best friend." Eduardo's expression softened as he turned to face Hannah. The girl's hands were twisted in Daisy's fur as she continued. "She helped me when I was scared. I couldn't even speak in front of people before, but she gave me courage. She saves our sheep when they wander off, and she protected our chickens from foxes." Taking a shaky breath, Hannah described the night of the storm, how Daisy had led her through the darkness to save the trapped toddler. "She's a hero," Hannah finished, wiping her eyes. "She belongs here with us." Eduardo listened intently, his fingers steepled under his chin. When Hannah finished, he stood and walked to the window, looking out over the farm. "Your daughter speaks from the heart," he said finally. "And everything she says about Daisy's abilities matches what we breed for: intelligence, courage, protective instincts." He turned back to face them. "But you must understand, these traits are precisely why we need her for our breeding program. The future of the entire breed could depend on dogs like her." Ben had been quiet, watching the exchange, his mind racing. Now he cleared his throat. "What if there was another way?" he asked, standing to join Eduardo at the window. "What if Daisy stayed here, but we worked with you to help revive the breed?" Eduardo's eyebrows rose slightly. "Here? On this farm?" He glanced around the modest kitchen, taking in the worn linoleum and dated appliances. "Mr. Whitmore, our breeding program requires extensive facilities, specific protocols, We have land, Ben pressed on, experience with animals, and most importantly, we have Daisy's trust and love. Couldn't that be valuable to your program? Eduardo frowned thoughtfully. It's not just about facilities. These dogs require specialized training, particularly in herding. Our breeding dogs must prove their working abilities. Daisy's a natural, Hannah interrupted. She started herding our chickens the very first day. Eduardo held up a hand. Natural talent is one thing. Professional level herding is another. He paced the kitchen slowly, considering. However, if she truly has the abilities you claim. He stopped, turning to face them. Perhaps we could arrange a test. Ben leaned forward eagerly. What kind of test? A herding trial, Eduardo explained. Professional level. If Daisy can demonstrate the skills required of our breeding dogs, perhaps we could discuss some form of arrangement. He pulled out his phone, checking his calendar. I can stay in town for 1 week. That should give you time to prepare her. Hannah's face lit up with hope, but Eduardo held up a warning finger. Understand this. If she fails to meet the standards, she returns to Portugal. Our breeding program cannot be compromised, no matter how attached you've become. Ben nodded solemnly. 1 week to prove herself. What exactly will she need to do? Eduardo began outlining the requirements: complex herding patterns, distance work, precise control of multiple animals. As he spoke, Daisy's ears perked up, as if she understood the challenge being laid before her. 1 week, Eduardo repeated, standing and straightening his jacket. I'll arrange for proper livestock and an official observer. If she passes, we can discuss terms for incorporating your farm into our breeding program. If she fails... He left the sentence hanging. Hannah knelt beside Daisy, burying her face in the dog's fur. She won't fail, she whispered. I know she won't. Eduardo gathered his things, pausing at the kitchen door. I truly hope you're right, he said softly. For everyone's sake. He nodded to Ben and Clara. I'll return tomorrow morning to begin the training assessment. As Eduardo's car disappeared down the gravel driveway, the family gathered in the kitchen, the weight of the challenge ahead settling over them. They had 1 week to prove that their beloved stray was worthy of her prestigious bloodline, 1 week to save their family from being torn apart. Ben knelt beside Hannah and Daisy, placing a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. We'll start training first thing tomorrow, he said firmly. Every minute counts. Clara joined them, completing their circle around Daisy. We'll all help, she added. Whatever it takes. Daisy looked at each of them in turn, her intelligent eyes seeming to understand the gravity of the situation. Then, as if to reassure them, she gave a soft woof and wagged her tail, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Ben and Hannah made their way to the pasture. Dew sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds, and their boots left dark trails as they walked. Daisy trotted beside them, her head held high, alert and ready. Okay, sweetie, Ben said, pulling out a worn book on herding techniques he'd stayed up late studying. We're going to start with the basics and work our way up. Hannah nodded, her face set with determination. She'd spent hours the night before watching videos of herding trials, memorizing commands and patterns. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, but there was a fierce light in them that Ben had never seen before. They started with simple exercises, teaching Daisy the whistles and commands she'd need to know. To their amazement, she seemed to grasp concepts before they'd even finished explaining them. When Ben demonstrated a gathering pattern with his arms, Daisy immediately copied it with the small flock of sheep they'd borrowed from a neighboring farm. She's incredible, Ben muttered, watching as Daisy expertly maneuvered the sheep through a series of tight turns. It's like she's done this her whole life. Hannah beamed with pride. She's the smartest dog in the world, she declared, then called out, "Come by." Daisy responded instantly, circling the flock clockwise with precise movements. They worked through the morning, taking breaks only when necessary. Hannah refused to stop for lunch, instead munching on a sandwich while watching Daisy practice more complex maneuvers. Her notebook filled with observations and diagrams as she tracked Daisy's progress. Word spread quickly through the small town about the Whitmores' situation. By early afternoon, trucks began pulling up to the farm. First came old Mr. Johnson with his border collie, offering to help with training tips. Then Mrs. Peterson from the diner arrived with a box of sandwiches and encouraging words. "Don't you listen to that Rick Caldwell," Mrs. Peterson said, setting down the food. "He's just jealous because his dog can barely fetch a stick." More townspeople arrived throughout the day. Some brought food, others offered supplies, or help with farm chores so the family could focus on training. Clara, who had initially been wary of such a risky venture, found herself surrounded by supporters who shared stories of successful farm expansions and breeding programs. "You know," said Sarah from the feed store, spreading out some pamphlets on modern farming techniques, "with the right setup, you could turn this into something special. Not just dog breeding, but a whole educational center." Clara's eyes widened as she listened to the possibilities. She began taking notes, her practical mind already calculating costs and potential returns. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond just scraping by. But not everyone celebrated their efforts. Rick Caldwell watched the stream of visitors from his property with growing anger. That night, after everyone had gone home, he crept over to the Whitmores' fence line. With quick, furtive movements, he loosened several key posts and sections of wire. "Let's see how special that dog is when all the sheep scatter," he muttered to himself. But Daisy was already aware of his presence. She'd been watching from the shadows of the barn, her keen senses alert to any threat to her family's farm. As Rick finished his sabotage and slunk away, she quietly made her rounds, checking each section of fence. When 3 sheep found the weakened section and tried to squeeze through, Daisy was there in an instant. She herded them back with gentle but firm movements, then positioned herself near the compromised fence, standing guard until morning. Ben discovered the damage at dawn and quickly repaired it. "Good girl," he said, patting Daisy's head. "You're not just herding anymore, are you? You're protecting your home." The pattern repeated over the next few days. Each night, Rick would try something new, creating gaps in different sections, leaving gates slightly ajar, even attempting to spook the animals with noise. But Daisy thwarted him at every turn, her intelligence and dedication proving far greater than his spite. The town's support grew stronger as word of Rick's attempts at sabotage spread. People began taking turns driving by the farm at night, keeping watch. Others offered security cameras and extra lighting. The community's protective circle around the Whitmores tightened, making Rick's efforts increasingly difficult. Through it all, Hannah and Daisy worked tirelessly. They practiced complex herding patterns until both were exhausted, then practiced some more. Hannah's voice grew stronger as she called out commands, her confidence building with each successful maneuver. Daisy responded to her with an understanding that went beyond mere training. There was a deep bond between them, a partnership built on trust and love. On the final night before the test, Hannah sat in the grass behind the house, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Daisy lay beside her, her head resting in Hannah's lap. The air was cool and still, carrying the sweet scent of late summer flowers. "Remember when we first found you?" Hannah whispered, running her fingers through Daisy's fur. "I was so scared of everything back then. Storms, speaking up, meeting new people. She smiled softly. "But you changed all that. You showed me how to be brave." Daisy's tail thumped gently against the ground, her warm eyes fixed on Hannah's face. "No matter what happens tomorrow," Hannah continued, her voice catching slightly, "I love you. You're my best friend." She leaned down and pressed her face against Daisy's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of her fur. Daisy lifted her head and gently licked Hannah's hand, her eyes full of trust and affection. They sat together under the vast canopy of stars, two friends sharing a quiet moment before facing whatever tomorrow might bring. The morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect day for Daisy's test. The training field buzzed with activity as people from all over town gathered to witness the event. Eduardo Moreira stood with a group of distinguished-looking individuals, expert breeders he'd flown in from Portugal specifically for this evaluation. They spoke in hushed Portuguese, occasionally gesturing toward the field where various obstacles and gates had been set up. Dr. Navarro moved through the crowd, clipboard in hand, stopping occasionally to explain the significance of certain test elements to curious onlookers. The atmosphere crackled with nervous energy as more people arrived, forming a wide circle around the testing area. Hannah stood at the edge of the field, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted Daisy's collar. Ben placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, while Clara watched from nearby, wringing her hands with nervous anticipation. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. "Remember what we practiced," Ben whispered to Hannah. "You and Daisy know what to do. Just trust each other." Daisy sat calmly beside Hannah, her intelligent eyes scanning the field. She appeared unruffled by the crowd's presence, focused entirely on the task ahead. The flock of sheep waited in a pen at the far end of the field, their wool gleaming in the morning sun. Eduardo stepped forward, his expression serious. "We will begin with the basic elements," he announced, his accented voice carrying across the field. "Then we will progress to more complex challenges. The dog must demonstrate not only herding ability, but also intelligence, control, and quick thinking." Hannah nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She led Daisy to the starting position, aware of every eye watching them. The Portuguese breeders murmured among themselves, making notes on their clipboards. The first challenge began. Daisy needed to separate 3 specific sheep from the main flock, ones marked with small red ribbons. Hannah took a deep breath and gave the command, but her voice came out shaky. Daisy glanced back at her, sensing her nervousness, and hesitated. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Eduardo's expression remained neutral, but his pen hovered over his notepad. Hannah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering all the nights she'd spent talking to Daisy, all the storms they'd weathered together. She leaned down and whispered, "Come by, girl. Show them what you can do." Something in Hannah's voice changed, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Daisy's ears perked up, and suddenly she was moving, a blur of focused energy. She circled the flock with precision, carefully maneuvering through the sheep until she had identified the marked ones. With careful movements, she separated them from the group, never once allowing them to rejoin the main flock. The Portuguese breeders straightened, their interest clearly piqued. Dr. Navarro smiled, making rapid notes on his clipboard. Next came the obstacle course. Hannah directed Daisy through a series of commands, both verbal and with hand signals. Daisy guided the sheep through narrow gates, around tight corners, and over small ramps. Her movements were fluid and precise, anticipating the sheep's reactions before they happened. "Remarkable control," one of the Portuguese breeders muttered. "She reads the sheep perfectly." Then came the predator test. A local farmer dressed in dark clothing began stalking the edges of the flock, mimicking a coyote's threatening behavior. Daisy's response was immediate and impressive. She positioned herself between the threat and her sheep, using her presence to both calm the flock and deter the predator. The crowd watched in amazement as Daisy demonstrated technique after technique, responding to Hannah's increasingly confident commands. Even Eduardo's stern expression had softened slightly, replaced by professional interest. Just as Daisy was guiding the sheep through the final series of obstacles, a commotion erupted at the edge of the field. Rick Caldwell's old sheepdog had broken free from its leash. The dog charged forward, barking wildly, heading straight for the flock. People gasped. Hannah's heart jumped into her throat. The sheep, startled by the sudden chaos, began to scatter in panic. The careful organization of the test dissolved into chaos as sheep ran in all directions. Rick made a show of calling his dog, but a slight smirk betrayed his true intentions. The Portuguese breeders rose from their seats, their expressions concerned. Eduardo's face darkened with disappointment. For a split second, everything seemed lost. But then Daisy sprang into action. She moved like lightning, her training and instincts working in perfect harmony. She raced to cut off the sheep's escape routes, her body low and fast, her movements precise and calculated. The crowd watched in awe as Daisy systematically gathered the scattered sheep. She worked in expanding circles, bringing in the strays one by one, all while keeping the already gathered sheep calm and contained. Her intelligence showed in every movement. She wasn't just herding blindly, but thinking several steps ahead, predicting where sheep might bolt and preventing it before it happened. Rick's dog, confused by Daisy's authoritative presence, backed away from the flock. Daisy gave a single sharp bark that sent the other dog retreating to its owner, tail tucked. Within minutes, Daisy had not only regained control of the situation, but had the sheep back in perfect formation, calmly guiding them through the final obstacles as if nothing had happened. The entire crowd held its breath as she completed the last element of the test, bringing the flock to a perfect stop exactly where they needed to be. For a moment, absolute silence fell over the field. Then, as if a dam had broken, the crowd erupted into cheers. People jumped to their feet, applauding and shouting their approval. The Portuguese breeders were talking rapidly among themselves, gesturing enthusiastically. Eduardo stood, his face showing clear admiration. Daisy had not just passed the test, she had exceeded all expectations, turning what could have been a disaster into a stunning display of skill and intelligence. The crowd's cheers gradually died down as Eduardo Moreira made his way across the field. His polished shoes left small indents in the grass as he approached Daisy and Hannah. The entire gathering seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his verdict. Hannah's fingers found her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. Clara wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders, both of them watching Eduardo's every move. Ben stood nearby, his weathered farmer's hands clasped together, years of worried lines etched deeply in his face. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training field as Eduardo stopped in front of them. Daisy sat perfectly still beside Hannah, her intelligent eyes fixed on the Portuguese breeder. The town's residents pressed closer, forming a loose circle around the scene. Dr. Navarro stood with his clipboard tucked under his arm, while the other Portuguese breeders whispered among themselves, occasionally nodding and gesturing toward Daisy. Eduardo cleared his throat, and the remaining murmurs from the crowd fell silent. He looked down at Daisy, studying her with the practiced eye of someone who had dedicated his life to these dogs. His expression remained carefully neutral, though there was a slight softening around his eyes. "What we have witnessed today," Eduardo began, his accented voice carrying clearly across the field, "was not just a display of herding ability. It was a demonstration of everything the Cão de Castro Laboreiro breed represents: intelligence, adaptability, protective instincts, and an extraordinary bond with their human family. He paused, and Hannah's grip on her mother's hand tightened. Clara could feel her daughter trembling slightly beside her. The entire town seemed to lean forward, hanging on Eduardo's every word. "Daisy has proven herself beyond a doubt," Eduardo continued, nodding approvingly. His stern expression finally broke into a small smile. But then he paused, turning to look directly at Hannah. The young girl met his gaze, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "She is more than just a great herding dog," Eduardo said softly. "She is part of your family." This became clear to me, not just during the test, but in watching how she responds to you, how she protects you, how she helps you grow stronger. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Daisy pressed closer to her leg, as if sensing her anxiety. Ben and Clara exchanged quick glances, hardly daring to hope. Eduardo straightened his shoulders and spoke with authority. "Therefore, I have made my decision. I will not be taking Daisy back to Portugal." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Hannah's eyes filled with tears as Eduardo continued, "Instead, I would like to propose something different, a partnership." He turned to address Ben and Clara as well. "If you are willing to care for Daisy and her future puppies, maintaining the high standards of the breed, she can remain here with Hannah while still contributing to the breed's revival." Hannah's legs nearly gave out as relief flooded through her. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around Daisy's neck and burying her face in the dog's soft fur. "You're staying?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're really staying?" Daisy responded by licking Hannah's tears away, her tail wagging happily. Clara wiped her own eyes while Ben's face broke into a broad smile. From the edge of the crowd came a sudden commotion. Rick Caldwell, his face dark with anger, turned and stormed toward the parking area. His boots kicked up dust as he walked, muttering under his breath. His old sheepdog trailed behind him, head low. The townspeople watched him go in silence, their faces showing their collective disappointment in his behavior. His attempts to sabotage the Whitmores had not only failed, but had revealed his true character to everyone. Eduardo paid no attention to Rick's departure. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. This contains all the necessary paperwork, breeding guidelines, health requirements, and our agreement terms. We will need to discuss the details, of course, but the essential point is this: Daisy stays here where she belongs. Ben stepped forward, emotion clear in his voice. "Mr. Moreira, we can't thank you enough. We'll make sure Daisy and her puppies receive the best care possible." Eduardo nodded, extending his hand. "I believe this will benefit everyone: the breed, your family, and most importantly, Daisy herself." Ben grasped Eduardo's hand firmly, the handshake sealing their agreement. Clara stood slightly apart from the group, watching Hannah laughing as Daisy showered her with affectionate licks. The morning sun caught the tears on her daughter's cheeks, making them sparkle like diamonds. Clara felt her heart swell with hope as she whispered, barely audible, "We're not losing the farm. We're finally growing." The other Portuguese breeders approached, offering their congratulations and beginning to discuss the technical aspects of the breeding program with Ben. Dr. Navarro joined them, adding his expertise to the conversation. The townspeople started to disperse, chattering excitedly about the morning's events and what this might mean for the Whitmore farm's future. Through it all, Hannah remained on the ground with Daisy, her arms still wrapped around her beloved dog. The fear and anxiety that had gripped her for so long seemed to melt away in the warmth of knowing that her best friend would stay by her side. Daisy sat patiently, her steady presence a reminder of all the ways she had helped Hannah grow stronger and braver. The morning sun continued to climb in the sky, casting its golden light over the training field, where a family's future had just changed forever. The scattered hay bales and herding obstacles stood as silent witnesses to the moment when a rare Portuguese dog found her permanent home on a small American farm, with a little girl who needed her just as much as she needed them. The autumn breeze carried the sound of hammering and sawing across the Whitmore farm. 3 weeks had passed since Eduardo's decision, and the property was already transforming. Workers moved back and forth, constructing a specialized training pen near the main barn. The sturdy wooden posts and carefully measured gates would soon become the centerpiece of their new breeding program. Ben stood at the edge of the construction site, reviewing blueprints with the foreman. His weathered face showed less strain these days, replaced by an expression of quiet determination. The farm that had once teetered on the edge of financial ruin was finding new life. Visitors' cars lined the gravel driveway, some bearing license plates from neighboring states. Word had spread quickly about the rare Portuguese herding dog living on the modest American farm. Clara had set up a small welcome area on the front porch, where she handed out informational packets about the Cão de Castro Laboreiro breed and answered questions from curious guests. Daisy moved through the crowd with natural grace, her presence commanding attention without seeking it. She stayed close to Hannah, who was slowly growing more comfortable speaking to strangers about her beloved dog. The young girl's voice, once barely above a whisper, now carried across the yard as she explained Daisy's herding techniques to an impressed group of visitors. "She can control the whole flock with just a look," Hannah explained, her hand resting on Daisy's head. "And she knows exactly where every sheep should be." As if on cue, Daisy's ears perked up. She turned toward the pasture where 2 lambs had wandered too close to the fence. Without needing a command, she trotted over and guided them back to the main flock, demonstrating the natural instincts that made her breed so special. The visitors murmured in appreciation, many of them taking photos and videos. A local news reporter scribbled notes in her notebook, preparing a story about the international partnership that was breathing new life into a struggling family farm. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen table had become a command center of sorts. Papers covered its surface, breeding schedules, construction plans, and marketing materials sent by Eduardo. Clara sat there during quiet moments, studying everything she could about dog breeding and farm diversification. The woman who had once seen farming as a dead end now pored over agricultural magazines and business plans with growing enthusiasm. As the afternoon sun began to soften, the visitors departed, and the construction crew packed up for the day. Hannah made her way to the living room, clutching a sheet of paper covered in her neat handwriting. The school's public speaking contest was just days away, and she had been practicing whenever she could. A small group gathered to watch her practice, her parents, Noah, and a few neighbors who had stayed behind. Daisy settled into her usual spot near Hannah's feet, her warm presence providing silent support. Hannah took a deep breath and began her speech about courage and friendship. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but she pushed through. When she stumbled over a difficult word, she didn't freeze up as she once would have. Instead, she glanced down at Daisy, found her strength, and continued. "Sometimes," Hannah read, her voice growing stronger, "the bravest thing isn't doing something big and heroic. Sometimes it's just taking one small step forward, even when you're scared. And sometimes the best help comes with 4 paws and a wagging tail." Clara squeezed Ben's hand as they watched their daughter speak. Tears glistened in Clara's eyes, but they were tears of pride and joy. The transformation in Hannah over the past months had been remarkable. After the speech, as Hannah accepted hugs and congratulations from her small audience, Ben's phone buzzed with a message from Eduardo. The Portuguese breeder had been keeping in regular contact, offering advice and support as they set up the breeding program. "Hannah," Ben called, smiling as he read the message. "Eduardo has something he'd like to ask you." Hannah came over, Daisy following faithfully at her heels. Ben showed her the message on his phone, an invitation to visit Eduardo's ranch in Portugal the following summer. The breeder wanted to teach Hannah about herding dogs and ranch life in his part of the world. Hannah's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? We could go to Portugal?" "If you want to," Clara said, joining them. "Eduardo thinks you have a natural way with the dogs. He wants to show you how they train puppies there." The possibility of such an adventure would have terrified Hannah just months ago. But now she nodded eagerly, already asking questions about what she might learn and see. As evening approached, Clara suggested they eat dinner outside to enjoy the mild weather. They carried plates of food to the picnic table, setting up their meal under the string lights Ben had installed along the porch. The construction site stood quiet now, its unfinished frame a promise of things to come. Daisy settled contentedly by Hannah's feet as the family took their seats. The dog's presence had become such a natural part of their lives that it was hard to remember a time when she hadn't been there. She watched over them all with those intelligent eyes, occasionally accepting gentle scratches from Noah or small treats from Clara. Ben lifted his glass of lemonade, looking around at his family. The worry lines that had creased his face for so long seemed lighter now. The farm that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that wouldn't be lost after all. Instead, it was growing into something new and unexpected. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass in a toast. Clara, Hannah, and Noah lifted their glasses too, while Daisy thumped her tail against the ground in apparent agreement. The evening light painted the farm in soft gold, highlighting the new construction, the grazing sheep, and the family gathered around their dinner table. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities they had never imagined, before a scared puppy sought shelter from a storm and found her way home. The morning of the public speaking contest dawned bright. Hannah stood before her mirror, adjusting her blue dress. Her reflection showed someone changed from months ago, though her hands still trembled as she gripped her speech. Clara knocked. "Ready, sweetheart?" Hannah nodded despite her churning stomach. She'd practiced countless times, but today she'd face the whole school, parents, and judges. The drive was quiet. Ben kept glancing at his daughter in the rearview mirror, sensing she needed silence. Daisy sat beside Hannah, a steady presence who hadn't left her side all morning. At school, the packed parking lot emptied into streams of chattering families. Hannah clutched Daisy's leash tighter as they entered the bustling hallway. The auditorium buzzed with activity. A teacher pinned number 7 to Hannah's dress. "You'll speak after Tommy Martinez." Clara hugged her. "We'll be right in front. You've got this." Ben squeezed her shoulder. "Just like we practiced." Hannah watched mutely as her parents led Daisy to their seats. Backstage, she crinkled her speech papers, anxiety mounting with each presentation. When Tommy finished his soccer speech, the announcer called, "And now, please welcome Hannah Whitmore." On wobbly legs, she approached the microphone under blinding lights. Panic tightened her throat until she spotted Daisy in the front row, brown eyes steady, tail wagging. Hannah breathed again. "My story begins with a storm," she started clearly. "Not just with thunder and lightning, but the kind that lives inside you." As she spoke about finding a shivering puppy in the rain, the audience faded away. She was simply telling her story. Sometimes courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it comes with a wagging tail and muddy paws. Sometimes it's in the way a friend believes in you before you believe in yourself. She described how Daisy had saved their farm, faced coyotes, rescued a child, and taught her that bravery meant acting despite fear. Daisy showed me that fear doesn't have to control you. She taught me that home is where you find your courage, your voice, and your family. Applause erupted. Her mother wiped tears. Her father beamed. Daisy wagged furiously. That evening, they watched sunset from their porch. The new training pen stood against the colorful sky, sheep bleating in the distance. Hannah sat with her hand in Daisy's fur. "We did it," she whispered. Daisy nudged her cheek as if to say, "I always knew you could." Ben and Clara shared proud smiles. Their once failing farm now thrived with new purpose. But more than the farm's transformation, they celebrated their daughter who had found her voice and her own kind of courage. And Daisy, once a lost puppy in a storm, had found exactly where she belonged. If you enjoyed the story of Hannah and Daisy, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.